Imagine waking up one morning to find that the price of bread has doubled, your salary is worth half of what it was yesterday, and your government announces that this pain is necessary because an international institution demanded it. Not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, but because of a rule written thousands of miles away. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This exact story has repeated itself across Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and parts of Asia. Different countries, different cultures, different decades. Yet the collapse followed the same pattern almost every time. Today, we are going to talk about how one IMF rule quietly helped destroy dozens of economies and why its effects are still shaping your world right now. At first glance, the International Monetary Fund looks like a global firefighter. Countries in financial trouble come knocking, and the IMF arrives with emergency loans. Politicians present it as a rescue. Media frames it as unavoidable. But buried inside these loans is a condition so powerful that it can rewire an entire economy in months. That rule is simple on paper and devastating in reality. Austerity as a prerequisite for survival. Austerity means cutting government spending fast and aggressively. Subsidies are removed, public sector wages are frozen or slashed, social programs are reduced, state-owned industries are privatized at record speed. The logic sounds clean and responsible. Governments must live within their means, budgets must be balanced, debt must be repaid. But economies are not households, and when this rule is applied to fragile nations, it often triggers a chain reaction that destroys demand, kills local industries, and locks countries into long-term dependency. To understand why this one rule became so powerful, you have to go back to the debt crises of the late 20th century. During the 1970s, many developing nations borrowed heavily, encouraged by cheap global credit. When interest rates in the United States suddenly spiked in the early 1980s, those debts exploded. Countries could no longer pay. Panic spread through international banks. The IMF stepped in as the lender of last resort, but with strings attached. The message was clear: follow our economic prescription or default and be cut off from global finance. What followed became known as structural adjustment. And this is where the destruction began. Fuel subsidies vanished, food prices surged, healthcare budgets collapsed, schools deteriorated, local industries that relied on modest government support suddenly had to compete with foreign corporations backed by massive capital. Domestic factories shut down. Unemployment soared. Economic growth stagnated for an entire decade, now remembered as the lost decade. Debt did not disappear. Poverty exploded. Africa experienced a similar fate. Nations were told to devalue their currencies to make exports cheaper. In theory, this would farmers were told to stop producing food for local markets and switch to cash crops for export. When global prices fell, entire rural economies collapsed. Governments were stripped of the ability to intervene because intervention violated IMF conditions. Sovereignty slowly eroded, replaced by spreadsheets and compliance reviews. Eastern Europe faced this shock in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. IMF-backed shock therapy pushed rapid privatization and deep spending cuts. State assets were sold at fire sale prices. A small elite captured enormous wealth while millions fell into poverty. Life expectancy dropped in several countries. Entire social safety nets vanished in a matter of months. Again, the same rule, the same result. Here is the critical flaw in the IMF austerity rule. It assumes that reducing government spending during a crisis restores confidence and growth. But history shows the opposite. When governments cut spending in a downturn, demand collapses further. Businesses lose customers. Tax revenues shrink. Deficits often get worse, not better. To compensate, governments cut even more. This creates a vicious cycle that is incredibly hard to escape. Another hidden consequence is political instability. When living standards crash rapidly, people lose faith in institutions. Protests erupt, governments fall, extremist movements gain ground. In many countries, IMF programs were followed by riots, coups, or long-term authoritarian rule. Economic pain does not stay confined to spreadsheets. It spills into streets, homes, and future generations. Supporters of the IMF argue that these reforms are necessary medicine. they say the pain is short-term and the benefits long-term. In a few cases, countries eventually recovered, but even then, recovery often came after rejecting or heavily modifying IMF prescriptions. Countries that maintained control over spending, protected key industries, and paced reforms carefully tended to perform better. Those that followed austerity blindly paid a far higher price. Now here is where this story becomes even more relevant to you. After the 2008 financial crisis, elements of the same IMF logic appeared in Europe. Greece was forced into extreme austerity. Pensions were cut. Taxes were raised during a recession. Youth unemployment reached catastrophic levels. The economy shrank by more than a quarter. Debt increased instead of decreasing. The pattern repeated itself in real time, in full view of the world. And yet, the rule remains powerful. Because the IMF does not just provide money, it provides a seal of approval. Without it, countries are locked out of global markets. Investors panic, credit dries up, governments feel they have no choice. Austerity becomes less of a policy decision and more of an economic ultimatum. If you are watching this and thinking this sounds distant, it is not. Global instability affects supply chains, migration, security, and financial markets everywhere. The collapse of one economy sends shockwaves far beyond its borders. This is why channels like Silent Collapse exist. Not to entertain you with numbers, but to expose the quiet mechanisms that shape global history while most people are distracted by headlines. If you want to understand how power really works in the global economy, this is the moment to stay connected. Subscribe to Silent Collapse because the most important stories are the ones nobody explains clearly. The most disturbing part of this story is not that one IMF rule caused so much damage. It is that it kept being applied despite overwhelming evidence of harm. Dozens of economies followed the same path. Dozens experienced the same collapse. And still, the rule survived. Not because it always worked, but because it protected creditors, stabilized banks, and shifted the cost of failure onto ordinary people. Today, many economists openly criticize austerity. Even the IMF has partially admitted its mistakes. But the legacy remains. Lost decades, lost generations, and a global system that still prioritizes financial stability over human stability. So the next time you hear about a country in crisis being offered a bailout, listen carefully to the conditions, because history has already shown us what happens when one rule is applied without understanding the lives it destroys. And if we do not learn from these silent collapses, they will not stay silent forever. What makes this even more dangerous is how quietly this rule operates in the background. There are no dramatic announcements, no global emergency alerts. The changes come as technical reforms, budget revisions, policy adjustments. But for ordinary people, the impact is immediate and brutal. Hospitals run out of supplies. Public transport becomes unaffordable. Small businesses disappear. And when citizens ask why this is happening, they are told there is no alternative. This is how economic power becomes invisible. Decisions that reshape millions of lives are framed as neutral economics rather than political choices. The IMF rule does not pull the trigger itself. It creates the conditions where collapse becomes inevitable, then steps back as the consequences unfold. By the time the damage is visible, responsibility is blurred across institutions, governments, and global markets. Another overlooked effect is how austerity changes behavior at every level of society. When the state retreats, corruption often grows. Officials scramble to protect themselves. Wealth concentrates at the top as public assets are sold cheaply to those with connections and capital. Inequality widens, and once it does, growth becomes even harder. An economy cannot thrive when most of its population is struggling to survive. What is rarely discussed is that many of these countries were not reckless spenders to begin with. Their crises were triggered by external shocks, interest rate hikes in rich countries, commodity price crashes, or sudden capital flight. Yet the burden of adjustment fell almost entirely on the weakest. This imbalance is not an accident. It is built into the system. As the world moves into an era of higher debt, climate stress, and financial volatility, the risk of repeating this cycle is growing. More countries are approaching the edge. More will be told that austerity is the only way out. The lesson from history is clear. When one rule is applied universally to very different economies, collapse is not a possibility, it is a pattern. This is why understanding these mechanisms matters now more than ever. Because the next silent collapse is already forming long before the headlines appear. And when it does, the story will sound familiar. A crisis, a rescue, a condition, and a population left to absorb the cost. There is also a deeper psychological impact that rarely gets measured in economic reports. When people experience repeated shocks, broken promises, and declining living standards, trust collapses. Trust in government, trust in markets, trust in the future. Young people stop believing that effort will be rewarded. Skilled workers leave. Brain drain accelerates. The very human capital needed for recovery quietly disappears, making long-term growth even harder. Over time, this creates a permanent state of fragility. Countries become stuck in a loop of borrowing, cutting, and borrowing again. Each IMF program is presented as temporary, yet many nations have spent decades under some form of IMF supervision. Instead of independence, they inherit a cycle of compliance. Economic policy becomes reactive rather than strategic, focused on meeting short-term targets instead of building resilience. What makes this especially troubling is that alternatives have existed. Countries that prioritized gradual reforms, protected essential public spending, and managed capital flows more carefully often avoided the worst outcomes. But these options require flexibility, and flexibility is exactly what one rigid rule removes. When austerity becomes non-negotiable, context no longer matters. Even today, the debate continues behind closed doors. Should governments invest during crises or cut back? Should debt be restructured fairly or extracted at any cost? These are not technical questions. They are moral ones. They decide who absorbs the pain and who is shielded from it. If history teaches us anything, it is that economic collapse rarely comes from a single dramatic mistake. It comes from systems that repeat the same rule despite evidence of harm. Silent collapse is about recognizing those patterns before they repeat again. Because the next time you hear that suffering is necessary for stability, remember this story. Stability for whom? Growth for whom? And collapse for whom?